Teaching reading in EFL classrooms seems to have quite a few hot topics. So let's have a look. So my question for you is, if you ask learners to read aloud, what do you state your aim as? What's your aim for that stage of a lesson where students read aloud? Let's see if we agree. So make a note. Okay, let's look at this issue of reading aloud. So, some people think it's for pronunciation, and I really don't agree with this. English is a stress-timed language. We merge words together. So, for example, first of all almost becomes festival. And many English words change their sound according to their environment. So if we take the word can, C-A-N, can you dance? So the word there sounds like can. But in response, I can say, I can dance. So can becomes kun. So it's not quite so easy reading aloud when the nature of our language is to mush words together and the sounds change. However, it can be argued that for individual word pronunciation, it is one way of checking. However, it's limited, and I think teachers are not always aware. They often think that reading aloud is about pronunciation generally, and it's not. It's about a very specific kind of pronunciation. However, it does help connect sound and symbol. So, for example, for Arabs, whose symbols they're writing, in other words, is completely different. It helps them to connect the sound with so for example, the, TH, they start to recognise that that's the sound produced by that set of letters. So there's value in it, that. However, you have to be very careful. A lot of teachers seem to confuse comprehension with reading aloud. I can read aloud Spanish or French. I can have a stab at reading aloud German, but I have very little idea what it means. So students can read aloud and have no idea what they're saying. So think again what the text is for. If you think that you're checking or decoding the meaning, then that's not what's happening when a student is reading aloud. Particularly with young students, younger learners, it can be a settling task. So if they've just come bouncing around from a big fluency task, it can be quite a good idea to calm everybody down with a little bit of going round a reading, because while student A is reading aloud, you can guarantee student B, C and D are all thinking, okay, that's my bit, and they're preparing. So it's a really good settling task. And weirdly, students love it. They get a strong sense of achievement. They feel like they're producing something in a foreign language, which is not to be undervalued. So I would say that reading aloud is about the teacher understanding the aim. If they're doing it because it has this kind of general pronunciation benefit, I would say no. If they're doing it so students understand the text, no. I'll give you a good example of reading aloud that really doesn't work. We sometimes see teachers asking students to read aloud instructions that are in front of everybody. So everybody can see the same instruction, and the teacher asks them to read it aloud as if this will aid comprehension, which it doesn't. So if you're an observer watching a teacher asking students to read aloud, make sure the teacher is clear of their aim. So it is not connected to comprehension at all. Okay, so how do you manage learners who want to check every word of text in their dictionaries. They can't move forward without checking every word. We all get them. So what's your strategy with these students? Okay. I think the first key is learner training. If students understand that in the real world, we don't read every word. In fact, what is often happening is our eye is in two places at least at once. In the first part of our eyes is looking at the word we're reading, but we're also scanning ahead. It's an amazing process to decide what words are important and what are not. So in fact, we don't actually read every word. It's unnatural. So we need to tell our learners why we're pushing them. For example, with the GIST task, you set a time limit. You want them to read quite fast. So time limits are great. The fastest reading will be with GIST. Comprehension takes a bit more time, but make sure that the guideline that I give is for teachers is take how long it would take you to read it, and then give half that time again. So 1.5 times is about the roughly how long you would give the students. And use countdowns. And countdowns are really interesting. We only see very good teachers using them. So a teacher may say, okay, I want you to do this reading in 2 minutes. But the really excellent teachers seem to be able to push throughout the text. So for example, 1 minute gone, okay, 30 seconds left, 5, 4. So this countdown, which keeps the pressure on, keeps the class moving, and you need to do it in order to get through the activities. So for the students who need to check every word, explain why it's not a good idea. Tell them that the tasks are designed to get firstly global meaning, then more detail. And then remember, you want them to read more than once. You don't want students reading once. You ideally get them to read the same text 3 or 4 times by changing the task type or type of task and giving different types of tasks that require different reading skills. Okay. Oh, teacher, the text is too hard. So how do you deal with that? The answer is change the task, not the text. You work too hard. You're a language teacher. You're always planning in your head, thinking it through, trying to personalise it, understand the grammar. You have enough on your plate. Change the task and not the text. However, you want to get students through the text. They need to feel that they haven't completely failed. So my advice is, if the text is too hard and everyone's struggling, kind of regroup and make the task much simpler, but allow some achievement. Yeah? So the detailed task will be the hard part. So ask the simpler GIST questions, who's in it? What's the overall subject? Where might this be set? Okay, so don't change the text. It's too much hard work. A big topic is pre-teaching vocabulary. What's your position, or what do you think are the possible objections to pre-teaching vocabulary? Make some notes. Okay. I think there's lots of problems with pre-teaching vocabulary, and personally it's very rare that I would do it. One of the problems with pre-teaching vocabulary is that you give the game away about the text. So you devalue the comprehension questions because they already know the answer, because you've taught them the vocabulary beforehand. If you pre-teach, you're working on assumptions about what learners don't know. And I think that it's far better to find out first what the learner does and doesn't know before you make that assumption. So pre-teaching assumes lack of knowledge, where maybe it's better to assume knowledge. It's interesting. In order to teach something, you have to contextualize it, because it's the context that gives meaning invariably, unless it's a very simple thing that you can show with a picture, substantial nouns like cup or whatever. So particularly with abstract, the more complex or abstract language requires more context. So if your reading, for example, is about crime and you've got the vocabulary, you need to use the context of the reading, ideally, but many teachers switch the context to teach the vocabulary in order not to give the game away. But if you think about it, that doubles the load for the student. They're having to learn one context, the language in one context, which they're going to transfer to another. It's a lot of work. Okay. Some people argue it saves time. I'm not convinced of that at all. The only thing that I would say is, yes, if your whole reading is about widgets, it may be an idea to pre-teach widget. But when we plan to pre-teach, we look at how we will present the meaning, how we will contextualize it, what it means, and also how we will check meaning. So what I would suggest is, rather than consider pre-teaching, anticipate lexis as an anticipated problem. So think, what do I think the students will have problems with? It'd be these 5 words. Okay, so I'm going to, if the students have problems with these words, I will use this means to explain. I'll use the context of the text that's already there. I'll create my meaning check questions around the context that they already have. And I'll bring in any additional meaning that I see fit. So rather than pre-teaching vocabulary, I would strongly suggest anticipate and prepare for vocabulary problems, but only step in if it's needed. Okay. So from a train-the-trainer perspective, what advice would you give to a teacher about selecting language for pre-teaching? If they feel they absolutely must pre-teach, I think it's the language that they need in order to get the general meaning of the text or to be able to answer specific questions. But like I said, my first piece of advice would be, do you need to pre-teach something? Okay. In teacher training, we often follow the principle of task before text. And you'd be amazed at how many times we have to reinforce this rule. So, why do you think this rule exists and how might it benefit the learners? The answer is that very often we get teachers give students a reading, no context, just slap it down on the table. And the students read, and then the teachers ask the questions, which is really hard for students to do. If you give the questions or the task before the text, the students can guide how they read. They can work out they read in order to complete the task. If you give the task after the text, they have no idea what they're reading for. So they're going to try and focus on every single thing, every single word. So as a rule, always give tasks before text. I would say the exception would be at advanced levels where perhaps the text is quite short and you may want to test them in a different kind of way. But as a general rule, as a trainer, you want to see your teachers giving the task for everything before the students actually do the activity. So if students know what they're doing, they can guide how they do it, and they get a sense of achievement, and they know when they're completed, and the task will dictate how they approach the text. Okay, so as with all things, with your teachers, you are looking to see that they're very, very clear on the aim of what they're doing at any point in the lesson. At any point, you should be able to ask the teacher, why are you doing that in this way? And your really good teachers will in the end be able to articulate it. However, I can assure you that even the most advanced teachers struggle to know the aim of everything. We get into habits. So it's quite good for your own reflective practice to work out why you've been doing what you're doing.